Hello, I'm Nick Kitchen. I'm an organisational consultant, an executive coach and facilitator. And I work a lot with organisational design and organisational change. The two are hugely interlinked. And today, therefore, we'll look particularly at organisational structure, organisational design and organisational structure. And I suppose posing the question, are dinosaurs really extinct? Or do they still hide away in the structure of organisations and the memory of organisations that inform still the way they operate? And could they do with that being updated? So particularly, the outcomes from this next 10-15 minutes will be to outline the foundation concepts of organisation design and to explore being able to design and align the appropriate organisational structure to a desired business model and the objectives and the market realities. So why is this so important? Well, I suppose self-evidently, organisational structure is critical in allowing an organisation to respond as best it can to its marketplace and its customers. Let's look at the business environment context. Clearly, the context of the business environment has a significant influence on the structure. And there are some key things to consider. I mean, how complex is your operation? How complex is it likely to be? What is the degree of stability in the business, and indeed the degree of stability in the marketplace? The two clearly will be correlated. And what is your strategic focus? Where are you heading? Who do you see yourselves as an organisation? And the building blocks that go towards building your value proposition are mapped out here. Variety of things. We're looking at organisational structure. Clearly, finance and funding. Can you afford it? How do you measure it? Very important. What's measured tends to get done. And what's your strategy? And people practices. I think the thing to remember in here is so often in the world of scientific management, people were considered as units of labour or units of resource. It's still called human resources. And I think as we consider organisational architecture, be mindful that we're working with people with all their desires and expectations and their ability to bring as much of themselves to the organisation as possible. Organisations have moved increasingly away from bureaucracy, and one of the driving forces for this has been globalisation. The phenomenal diversity and different mores and cultures that organisations now have to contend with and engage with and work through means that having an overly bureaucratic organisation increasingly won't work in a global context. And the two polarities really around organisational design sort of fluctuate between and pulsate between really centralisation and decentralisation. And this is a concept about who gets to make decisions and control resources at what level in the organisation, and possibly in what geographical context. So centralisation tends to suggest that there's a concentration of authority in the hands of top executives. Decentralisation is devolving power to the periphery and devolving decisions down to more closer to the customers. And there are pros and cons for each approach. In my experience, what happens is companies tend to swing one way, then they tend to swing back the other. It seems to go through cycles, actually. And there are strengths and weaknesses to both approach. In terms of preference, increasingly people are recognising, particularly in a global context, the closer you can have the decisions made to the marketplace and the customers by those who have the correct information, the more likely it is you're going to be effective in the marketplace. That throws up some challenges. However, in terms of customer responsiveness, it's more likely you'll be a winner. So what have been the classic types of organisational structures? The original structure probably was a functional structure. So you would perhaps divide it into clusters of expertise. You'd have people who sold products. You had the product area. You'd have finance, probably human resources. And that had a lot to commend it. Because you'd have areas of expertise, you would build abilities within those areas to do that job particularly well. And it was very simple. There were challenges with that, of course, because increasingly, if I go back to these areas of expertise would find it very hard, increasingly, to talk to their areas. There was a type of person that would be attracted to sales and marketing, and that type of mentality and view of the world would be a different one than those attracted to finance. And at times it feels like two very different companies when you're talking to different streams. Manufacturing would be another line as well that have its own beliefs and views and ways of working. So the big challenge there is how you can communicate effectively and rapidly between the silos. Geographic structure. So as organisations became more international, then it became appropriate, or we covered a wider area, for them to have structures along the lines of the areas and time zones in which they're operating. So classically, organisations internationally were split into the Americas, EMEA, Europe, Middle East and Africa, and Asia Pacific. If you look at these countries, though, under these headings, EMEA covers everything from sort of Western, Mid-Atlantic thinking in the UK, through the Middle East and Qatar, and down through Africa. So there's nothing homogeneous about that area. Perhaps slightly more so for the Americas, and again, APAC, from Australia to Japan and Hong Kong, a whole range of different cultures there. So even within that, actually, there are significant changes. So often they were subdivided as well. Again, that had great strength in that people could be close to the decisions on the ground and hopefully would understand the local culture. The downside was, of course, that sometimes some of these areas would go rogue or would start to only pay attention to their area. And the arguments that would go on about, well, I understand Japan and this won't work and the corporate view won't work there, versus how do we have consistency across the whole organisational offering? Well, those tensions consistently exist in those types of structures. So what sometimes would then happen is, another development would be that, particularly if there was a proliferation of business activities and product lines, is that they would be grouped together in strategic business unit structures or divisions. So, for example, P&G, Procter & Gamble, they would have a whole range of different detergent areas, personal care, possibly paper products. Other companies would have food and beverage. Again, a lot of focusing on the products and therefore very closely aligned with marketing and the customers they had to deal with. But what would sometimes happen, the challenge there would be that each would become its own fiefdom, and indeed sometimes at the margins they'd start to cannibalise one another. There'd be overlaps and competition. And for the CEO and for people who were minded to have a sense of what was the overall proposition from the company, they trying to have consistency of standards across that whole area would be quite challenging. And probably, therefore, an increasingly common structure that we're finding, particularly globally, is the matrix structure, where you try and embrace the best of the regional split with the best of the business-focused split as well. So boxes that look like this, lines up and lines down. So perhaps America, EMEA, APAC, former Soviet Union might be in there as well, and others. And then you have sales, finance, product quality, or product lines across those regional structures. And so the people in the various offices would therefore have a boss who would be a regional boss and could relate locally and understand locally, and also have somebody with whom they were aligned on a product basis or on a sort of business activity basis. At their best, matrix structures work wonderfully. They're responsive, people can collaborate across them. Some great examples of those would be the professional practices, professional service firms, where they have this notion of partner, and so people are really clear that actually they need to align with both the local needs, but also the international client needs and the international professional service needs itself. So at their best, they work really well. At their worst, you can get infighting, you can have companies ground to a halt because you can have people who have two bosses, each telling them what to do, and they are divergently opposite. So how you manage competing priorities in a matrix is of huge importance. So team structures, a team would have representatives of a variety of disciplines within there, and they'd pool their expertise. So you'd have someone who was an expert on suspension, you'd have engineers and designers working together, and seeing the bigger picture, so that there wasn't a finished article then presented to manufacturing who would then throw it out to say, well, we can't do this, because there would be a manufacturing person in that team as well, for example. And actually that's more fun. For people that was more fun to work in that way and to have a greater sense of ownership of the whole product. So in summary, in terms of the internal planning environment, you've got strategy, and those are the subject of other programs, and people practices. We talked about how organisation structure affects people practices, metrics, processes, and finance. And the key thing, again, as you're considering an organisational structure, is this: in a marketplace that's growing increasingly fragmented in most cases. No, it's not true. In marketplaces that are increasingly dynamic, sometimes some are becoming fragmented, some are agglomerating enormously. They work across almost every part of the world, and the pace of change in almost all of these is exponential. How can you have a structure that allows for people to respond really, really quickly and effectively to those challenges, whilst having a sense of the organisation, and whilst having a sense of holding and clear guidelines for anyone in the organisation to touch. There is no simple answer for that. There are tensions in that all the time. And for leaders of organisations, the greatest skill a leader needs to have at times is how you manage competing tensions, and that creative tension can give rise to phenomenally successful organisations.